Hello. Back by popular demand, I have returned. Your swashbuckling, handsome, one-eyed bandit-killing Irishman. And once again, no bandit, pirate, or looter is safe from my swift justice. Today's journey shall begin in French territory. I've made the long journey down here in search of allies to help me liberate my sweet occupied Ireland. First, we'll begin by clearing out a bandit hideout near Paris, simply in an attempt to try and gain their attention, but also their favor. Once night had finally fell, I would sneak in under the cover of shadows with our German militiamen. They could really use some battle experience, and who better than some unsuspecting bandits? Warming your stinky little toes by the campfire, eh? Big mistake. Concealed by the shadows, we were like death himself. They had been completely caught off guard by our attack. France was so busy at war with England, these bandits thought they could terrorize the good Frankish folk and nobody would come to stop them. They were wrong. The bandit captain came out, completely outnumbered by us and our German militia. He would try to challenge me to a duel, as he knew it was his only chance of survival. Unfortunately for him, I would decline. We immediately killed his compadres and my men swarmed him like bees to honey. He was defeated and our mission was complete. After that was all said and done, I would travel to Paris to tell everyone of my good deeds and to also look for possible companions to join us. I'm afraid to say, but there were no companions here. However, I did find some of their finest mead and beer, as well as a nice gentleman playing the flute. Later into the evening, I would also have the good company of two beautiful women. But these ladies were all too comfortable showing off their ankles in the tavern. Good day to you, you disgusting floozies. I then began showing the locals a dance from my home country, the Irish jig, or at least the best that I could do. We didn't have any luck in the tavern, but on the road we would encounter one of the French lords. After a brief discussion, I had offered him my sword as well as the swords of my men against the British. Not only would I be able to try and fight them for the independence of Ireland, but I would also be able to do so and get paid 130 pieces, so of course we accepted. And just like that now, my friends, we are part of the war against Great Britain. However, it would seem that France is a bit outmatched. But this matters not, as we always do our best work when the odds are against us. We would hire some additional French militia before heading back across the sea into England to terrorize their lands and their armies. We had managed to pin down a party of 29 English peasants. They were not soldiers, but unfortunately this is war. We gave them an opportunity to back down, but they did not accept it, I'm afraid. We shall show them a quick death. The terrain was not exactly ideal for a battle, and they would wait across the swampy lands on us. It would seem that we're a bit on the back foot here, but we are much more well equipped. The smell of burnt gunpowder would fill the air of the muddy landscape as our militiamen began emptying their rifles into the peasants. It brings us no joy to pull out our swords and attack these poor fools, but I'm afraid that they've left us with no choice. For the next half hour or so, blades would clash and blood would be spilled. Finally, our last remaining enemy would attempt to escape, but I drew my pistol on him and stopped him in his tracks. The Lord had made us men, but the world had made us enemies. I'm sorry, my friend. It had to be done. To think that they would risk and lose their lives for the resources of their lords. This all could have been avoided if they would have just handed it over. Unfortunately for them, they did not, and we were victorious. We had managed to cross back into France just before a large English party could attack us. However, on the other side was yet another party, even though it was a bit smaller than our own. A beautiful noble woman by the name of Catherine. Even more shocking though, she knew who we were. I suppose word has been traveling quite quickly about good old Irish Macnalberg. Unfortunately, madam, we are still at war, though. On the other hand, even though we slightly outnumbered her, it was clear that her soldiers were much better equipped, much more experienced, and she also had much more cavalry units than we did, so we decided to let her go on her merry little way. However, after doing so, we were encountered by yet another party with a smaller amount of soldiers, but they had much more cavalry than we had. Luckily, we had lured them into some hills before the battle that that way we'll have a terrain advantage. I had positioned my riflemen upon a hilltop so that we may fire down at their mounted units. Now all we can do is hope and pray that it'll be enough to stop them. No doubt this will be our most intense battle yet, with the odds stacked firmly against us. Our enemies would begin advancing on us. I had hoped for a location with much larger mountains. Unfortunately, these small hills will give us very little cover and will be quite easy for them to traverse. Complete and utter chaos had ensued shortly thereafter. Smoke from all the rifle and pistol fire had began to burn our eyes, as the stomping and clacking from tens of horses filled the airwaves. I was faring quite well during the battle, but unfortunately at some point I noticed all of my men had fallen, while the vast majority of the enemy forces were still alive and well. I would continue to fight the good fight, but in the end there were far too many of them, and I had been subdued. Our enemies would begin to celebrate their victory as the corpses of our allies began to turn cold on the mountaintop. We had not been killed, but simply knocked unconscious and taken prisoner. After some time, one of the Englishmen had approached us and offered us our freedom for 431 pieces, which out of desperation, of course, we accepted. But the opportunity of escape was quickly squandered when we were captured once more and taken prisoner in London. But they would not be able to break my spirit. They would only make my hatred and my determination stronger. Eventually, we found an ample opportunity to break out of the dungeon. We would run to a nearby town where I would quite literally sell the clothing off of my back for a much faster horse so that we may escape their forces. We were now much faster and able to get away from them. We would end up making our way to another nearby village where we would actually end up hiring a few mercenaries to help us out. Later into the night, we were encountered by a large group of looters looking to rob us. Though they outnumbered us, we had been stepped on far too many times in the last few days, and we weren't going to have it. As my men shot from a firing line in the dark, I would circle them throughout the forest, firing off my weapons and occasionally getting in for some close-up action, sweeping between the trees like the Reaper himself. And eventually, we were victorious. We would be able to sell the belongings of these looters to hopefully fund our trip back to France. And though we were constantly being chased, we did eventually finally make it back into French territory, only to find out that we're now at war with Spain as well, so that should be fun. I would eventually link up with a French noblewoman by the name of Dorothy. She was amassing quite the army to try and weed out the British and the Spanish from our territories. We came across a British general by the name of David trying to ransack a French town, and we wouldn't have that. We'll ensure that this is David's last winter among the living, and we shall drive his men from this village and send them back across the sea where they belong. The thick snow upon the ground only added to the absolute chaos that was this battle. So much gunpowder in the air you could be side by side with your enemies and not even know it. Upon my mount I would hunt down the enemy cavalry, as our infantry would go toe-to-toe with theirs. In the end I got the final blow of the entire battle, and we were victorious once more. A glorious victory for the French and of course their Irish mercenary. It must be said I would much rather fight a proper army as well, compared to bandits or looters, because the equipment is worth so much more. We would stay with Lady Dorothy for quite a bit of time thereafter, up until the point that the British actually made peace with the French, after which point we disbanded from Lady Dorothy's army and went on our own for a bit. We would eventually stumble across Lord Armand Charles and his army, which was much, much larger, of course. We would join up with him so that we may continue fighting in this war against the Spanish. Now, we don't have any personal quarrel with the Spanish, but we must gain favor with the French. Besides, we're going to need money if we're ever going to liberate Ireland from the British, and money is going to be something we could get by selling Spanish gear, so I think you see where I'm going with this. We would eventually make it just outside the gates of the city of Lyon, where we would then encounter a massive Spanish army. And let me just say, my friends, this was about to be the largest battle that we had ever seen. We would charge into battle on horseback along with our allies across a small river. We would charge into hordes of Spanish soldiers, cutting them down in swaths. No one would be safe from the fury of the French. If we couldn't take their men, we would at the very least take their damn horses, and then their men after they hit the ground. After a couple of hours of fighting, a Spanishman with a keen eye had caught me in the back with a musket ball, and I fell off my mount. However, the battle would continue on without me. These brave Frankish folks had no intention of quitting anytime soon. The enemy had begun to bring in reinforcements, but they too would fall to their knees in the glory of the French Armada. With them defeated, we would then have the Lady Gabriella as our prisoner. She would surely fetch a fair ransom, as would her soldiers. Now, shortly thereafter, the French army would once again be facing down a large Spanish force. However, we would not be joining them, because with me injured, I knew that my men would most likely die without my guidance. It just wasn't worth it. The battle must have went in the French's favor in some way, shape, or form though, because right after that, the two kingdoms ended up making peace, which also kind of left us out of a job. So for a good bit of time, we would begin helping out the Frankish folk in other types of ways, such as herding some large groups of cattle to a nearby village. That way the people can eat, and that way we can also make some money off of it. And we would also do our standard work of hunting down bandits, looters, and pirates in the area just for funsies, and also once again to make money. But it wouldn't take very long before the British and the French were at each other's throats once more, and we were joining up with yet another noble army, patrolling the French countryside looking for any enemies and occasionally finding a few large groups of them. All these battles had us quite proficient with a pistol on horseback, but my sword work could use a little bit of training. After slaying more of our enemies, we had arose victorious from another battle. But something more interesting was just around the corner. We would actually begin laying siege to a fortified city. We had never been part of a siege before, but as an Irish lad, we had heard many tales by our village elders. But nothing would quite prepare us for the reality. We damn near lost our head in the first few moments, having to take cover behind a barricade to try and fire at the enemies. We couldn't see for shit, to put it mildly. The men were swift and hardy, though, bringing over a siege tower so that we may climb their walls. Though they may try, they won't be able to keep us out of there for much longer. I would trail behind our forces and try to pick off the riflemen that were in the towers. Because it was during this siege, I noticed we had too many of Frenchmen falling to their muzzles. After I was finished picking off those that I could, I would follow the men into the town. The Brits had put up a pretty fierce resistance thus far and had done a fair job at keeping us at bay. Now that we're within the town, though, that is no longer the case, I'm afraid. Much blood would be spilled over a static bridge as they tried to keep us out. This would be deemed as the Fight of Cedar Bridge, where many men on both sides would lose their lives. But finally, after many hours, the battle was over, and we were victorious once more. We had taken this city and claimed it in the name of France, liberating its people. We would continue our service to France and to the crown once we encountered yet another party of enemies. Though their party was much smaller than our own, they put up one hell of a fight and were quite tough. There could only be one explanation. Many of them must be our Irish brothers and sisters. Such a shame that we had to meet on opposite sides of the battlefield. It wouldn't be very long thereafter before we began yet another siege. This time we would be besieging a castle, much more fortified than the wooden fort that we had previously taken on. Much better equipped as well. We would have to try to sneak up in the tall grass so we didn't catch a cannonball to the old skull. I would do my best to try and protect the battering ram at all costs, because without it we would be up shit creek without a paddle. And by God, I don't even know how to swim. We were once again at quite the disadvantage with all their riflemen aiming down at us. It didn't help anything that our men had formed a large group that they could easily be shot in. But it was thanks to this massive amount of manpower that we busted open their gates and charged in. We began to quickly overwhelm their forces with nothing more than sheer strength and resolve, and also a few bullets. As the battle was winding down, I got a good look at their artillery. This would have hurt, that's for sure. But I am thankful to say that once again we have won yet another battle and taken yet another castle for France. And with the majority of their objectives complete, the army had disbanded disbanded, and we were once again on our own. While we were on our own, we had come across a French noblewoman raiding a British village and decided to help her out a bit. We had also chased down a little caravan of villagers from that same village and began to teach them a lesson all the same. It brings me no joy to attack the common folk, but some things must be done. We had also gotten into a bit of a skirmish with the two British generals, Mary II and George. We would be sure to make them sorry they ever crossed that ferry point. Alright lads, it's time that we sent them packing. As I'm sure you can tell, the terrain here was less than ideal for battle on horseback, but we would make it work as best we could. We were faring quite well, but the enemy riflemen line were becoming a bit of a pain in the ass for us, so I began charging in with my horse, hacking and slashing everyone I came into contact with. I didn't have to kill them as long as they missed their mark. That was what was important. And of course, that when the opportunity came, I wouldn't miss mine. As the sun began to set, we had littered these small hills with bodies. My steed and myself were covered in blood. We would end up sparing the lives of George and Mary, as they were worth much more to me alive than dead. We would also end up making a very pretty penny off all the loot that we got from them as well. And I also got this really sweet helmet. Don't get me wrong, I loved my tricorn hat, but this helmet would be much more effective at protecting my little noggin during these snowy battles. Speaking of which, this battle too wasn't all that difficult, as we severely outnumbered our enemies. I had thought my pistol skills might be good enough to take down their leader, but I shot her horse and my men finished her off for me. Truth be told, they really carried us throughout this battle and I had to do very little work, which was glorious. Eventually though, we would take the ferry into Great Britain and take the fight to them. By this point, we were the ones chasing down their armies. It did help that we were riding with some of the greatest French generals that the world had to offer, and this was the closest that we had come to our home country in months. So you could say that spilling the blood of these gentlemen on this battlefield was somewhat nostalgic. I've truly missed it here. By the end of the day, we were once again victorious and we had left plenty of food for the crows and buzzards. Now back in France once more, we would meet against an English army that was attacking one of our castles. As we rode against the enemies of France, the snowfall would begin to get quite heavy. They say war is hell, but we never anticipated it would be so cold. Physically and mentally, the warm flash of my pistol was a stark contrast to the icy elements, and the warm blood of those unlucky men who met my sword that splashed upon my frozen face. By this time in the night, the enemies had called upon their reinforcements. They had formed a firing line in the field, but by the grace of God and some Irish luck, I was never hit. Even the reinforcements had begun a retreat. I would take my horse and ram them as hard as I could. We would show our enemies no quarter, no mercy, and as dawn begun to break, the Battle of Icy Ridge was complete. I'm afraid that I lied about not giving our enemies any quarter, as we did take many of them prisoner to sell, but it was worth a pretty penny, so can you blame me? To celebrate my victory, I entered a local tavern. I purchased a bottle of their finest spirits and spent the rest of my night swapping war stories with a few other soldiers. One veteran in particular was quite interesting. He went by the name of Sven Bloodaxe. Now something tells me that's most likely not the name that his mother gave him upon his birth, and probably has something more to do with the fact that he said he assassinated someone in Rome or something like that. Well, either way, he was quite impressed with my glorious war stories and even offered to join my company. I would accept this proposal on one condition: we change out that god-awful outfit for a much more fitting uniform. Speaking of which, I would also purchase myself a much better set of uniform and armor. Now that is dapper. After that, the army would end up disbanding as we had once again made peace with Great Britain. This time around though, it would seem that the peace is going to last for a while, so I suppose we should find other means of employment, like cleaning up crime among the shores of France. Ah yes, old reliable as it were. I also thought that I might try my hand at yet another tournament in Paris. Not only could I make some money by selling the grand prize if I win, as well as betting on my own matches, but I would also get a little bit of glory. Now all we had to do was win. Easy enough. I would attempt to defend my teammates from a swordsman, and I ended up taking him down. After that, I decided to hide behind them as they a shot at the enemy riflemen, and this ended up being a good strategy. The second round seemed to be a tag team match against some other teams, but I wouldn't know as my only ally went down very quickly and I was basically all on my own, slashing all the other people in the back. It was just me and another bloke left, and after a little bit of clinking and clacking of the old swords, I was victorious. Ah, how I wish my men could see me now. Hopefully they're in the crowd. The third match, I faced an Italian gentleman, but he went down rather quickly. And for the fourth match, I would face off against a well-known French general who quickly rocked my socks for me. So now I'm out about 200 gold, and I don't get any glory. I would then decide to attack a nearby bandit hideout, hoping that this good deed would make everyone forget about my hilarious defeat in the tournament. When night fell, I, my men, and Signore Bloodaxe would attack them. I'd be lying to you if I said that we weren't somewhat reckless during this attack, but it hardly mattered as these gentlemen hardly had enough leaves to wipe their arses with, let alone any decent equipment. And I think what ended up making this most clear was when the bandit captain came out and challenged me to a duel, and he ended up getting... yeah, poor little fella, humiliated like that in front of his pals. Speaking of which, I had considered giving this handsome fella a new hole to breathe out of, but he didn't want the smoke, so instead I took him prisoner. The very next morning, we would attack the remaining members of their crew, but we had German reinforcements with us, so I'm not gonna bore you with the details. After that, though, I would end up encountering the King of France himself, Louis. Louis, my boy here, had requested that I go around to some nearby villages and collect taxes. Such an egregious request from anyone else would be met with my sword and pistol, but since he is the King of France, I had to oblige, especially since I want his support. Now, I will say that the king did give me permission to squeeze whatever I could out of the local folk, but I will not oppress or subject the people of France to such a thing. However, at the first village, one of the village elders approached us and told us about some issues with bandits, as well as some failures with their crops this season, and were stating that some of the poorer families can't pay. Now, this would have been fine, except they immediately began to tell me as well that if I try to force them to pay, they very well may fight. Now, I can smell a scam a mile away, and the fact that they immediately went into violence makes me think they're not the poor, desperate little peasants they're pretending to be. Nice try, rookies. You can't get one in over my head that easy. Over at the second village, as I began to collect my taxes, more families came forward saying that they couldn't afford to pay it for similar reasons, but offered up extra crops as payment. Of course, this was a viable solution. We're not a monster, but without the king's support, we'll never liberate our homeland, which is a goal I want to achieve so desperately in fact, that when we arrived at the third village and the retainers helping us collect taxes became mutinous, I ended up paying their wages out of my own pocket. After some time, though, I had finally returned back to the king, and after providing him with his taxes, he was happy, as you might imagine. A few days later, I would once again meet with the king in Paris, where he had yet another request of me. It would seem that over the winter season, he'd lost about a handful or so of his horses, and he needed me to get him some more, some very specific ones, and he was even offering me 10,000 big ones to do so. So I accepted. Funny enough, though, I already had 3 out of the 4 horses that the king required, as I had confiscated some of them from the British during our battles. So I ran to the market, traded off a few of my hogs and one of my cows for one of the horses, and we were good to go, but I forgot to record that part. We were paid handsomely, as promised, and the king himself was tickled plum pink about his pretty new horsies. But there was yet another proposal that I wished to make, one of marriage. I, Irish Omac Nowberg, would offer my own hand, heart, and soul to some lovely lady in exchange for a union with the French. Until next time, my friends.